So in the last video, we talked a little bit about the process by which bone is formed, which is known as ossification. And we got into intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification and talked about the fact that these processes actually begin to start forming our bones in utero. One of the things that you may or may not know is that ossification is a process that continues after a baby's born through childhood and up to about 24 years of age. So that's when our bones typically are fully ossified, they've reached their adult mature stature. But even after that ossification process has completed, our bones still go through what's known as bone remodeling. So here's what bone remodeling is, and here's what it does. If you could imagine a house where on one side you've got construction workers that are putting up walls, and right next to that you've got construction workers that are taking down walls, and basically those that are putting up are just replacing what's being taken down all the time, indefinitely, for your entire life. That's what's going on in the bone. So as we have bone being produced, even as adults, and being deposited, at the same time we've got bone being resorbed, which basically means that we're breaking down the bone, we're releasing the calcium to the blood, those kinds of things. Because of this, because we've got this bone remodeling that's going on, your skeleton completely changes every 10 years. So the bones that you have now are not at all the same bones that you had 10 years ago. All the bone that you had 10 years ago has been replaced by bone that you have now. The bone that you have now, you won't have any of in 10 years because that bone will all have been replaced. So what's there now will be taken out and new bone will be replaced. Why it's this way, I don't know. It's one of the things, honestly, that I still wonder about after teaching anatomy and physiology for 17 years. Just to show you an example of this, if you look down here at the bottom, I've got a couple of pictures of skulls. So the first one over here on the left is a skull of a 24-year-old, and you can see the suture lines where bones actually grew together in the fetus. And if you look over here at the skull of a 70-year-old, you'll notice those suture lines have basically disappeared. The reason for that is all the bone that was in here when this person was younger has been resorbed, it's been broken down, and it's been replaced with new bone. So we've got bone that's remodeling all the time. As you're learning about this and thinking about this, there's a couple of cell types that you should be familiar with. So first we have cells that are working to build bone, that are working to deposit bone, and these cells are known as osteoblasts. And I remember that osteoblasts build bone because osteoblasts have a B sound in them, and bone building, if you will, is what osteoblasts are doing. At the same time, we have these osteoclasts that are always breaking down bone. These are our bone resorbers. So normally, under normal circumstances, if you're an adult, if your nutrition isn't changing, if your exercise and activity levels aren't changing, then what we've got is this very nice communication that's happening between these osteoblasts and osteoclasts, whereby the osteoclasts are saying, hey, we took down this much bone, so you need to put back up this much bone. And they're very nicely working together so that your bone mass and your bone density stays consistent over time. Again, as long as your nutrition's not changing and your activity level is not changing. However, there are situations where even as an adult, even after you've got your mature bone, we can start to see a net increase in bone. So you may get an increase in bone density. And there are also situations that could cause you to have a net decrease in bone, so a decrease in bone density. And there's a couple of these that I want to introduce here before we get started on them. The first of these is what's known as the hormonal mechanism. So if something has changed in your diet, this is the most likely place that you would see the hormonal mechanism coming into place, because the hormonal mechanism regulates calcium levels in the blood and calcium levels in the bone. And we'll talk about it with the next slide. The other way that you could see either a net buildup or a net decrease in bone density as an adult after you've got your mature skeleton is due to changes in mechanical stress. And so what I mean by that effectively is changes in your activity level, changes in exercise. So if you start a new exercise program and you're working out and stressing your bones, you're going to see a net buildup in bone density. If you have stopped an exercise program or you've always been maybe a little bit of a couch potato, you're going to see a decrease in bone density because of that. So stressing the bones is another thing that will cause there to be either a net increase or a net decrease in bone density over time. So with this next slide, what I want to do is talk a little bit about that hormonal mechanism and what's actually going on. So this diagram is representing for us what's going on in the hormonal mechanism. And before we get into it, I want to talk a little bit about why there is the need for this situation in the body. So one of the things that you should definitely know about bones is they act as a calcium reservoir for the body. If the body is low on calcium, the bones will release it into the blood. If the body has sufficient levels of calcium, then that excess calcium will be put into the bones. So the bones are really a reservoir where we take calcium from if we need it. We deposit calcium in it if we don't. The reason that we're so worried about calcium levels in the blood and we're willing to take calcium out or put it into the bones is because if you remember from 227, well, I guess this is 227 and we haven't gotten there yet. One of the things that we're going to get to in this class a little bit later on is muscle contraction. And you will learn that calcium is involved in muscle contraction. The heart is a muscle. It's involved in contraction of the heart. So we need calcium to be within certain levels in the blood in order for the heart to be able to function properly. The diaphragm, so that's the muscle that's involved in breathing. Because it's a muscle, it also requires calcium to be able to contract. So if calcium levels are too high in the blood, if calcium levels are too low in the blood, then we have a situation where we can start interfering with the way that the heart works and the way that the diaphragm works, and then you have a situation where you can't breathe, blood isn't flowing because the heart isn't contracting properly, and that, of course, can lead to death. So it's very, very important that we closely regulate the calcium levels in the blood. And if there's not enough calcium in the blood, we're going to take it out of the bones, and the bones are going to take a hit because calcium is really what makes the bones strong. And if the bones are losing calcium and putting their calcium into the blood, they're going to become weaker, they're going to become less dense, they're going to be more likely to break. If calcium levels are where they need to be, or there's excess calcium, then we're okay to take some of that calcium out of the blood and put it into the bones as a storage place for later. And again, because calcium is what causes the bones to be strong, by doing so, we're going to build up bone density and we're going to keep the bones thick and strong and how they need to be. So those are the reasons that we have hormones that are kind of regulating blood calcium levels, and in doing so, affecting calcium levels in the bones. It's because just for the simple sake of survival, it's more important that there's sufficient calcium in the blood than there is that there's sufficient calcium in the bones. So if you look at this diagram here, this is trying to show us a homeostasis of blood calcium levels. Blood calcium levels are where they're supposed to be, but let's say we get an imbalance. So for whatever reason, maybe it's because you don't have a calcium-rich diet, or maybe you do, but you don't get enough vitamin D. And if you don't get enough vitamin D, you're going to have problems absorbing calcium. Maybe you just have a malabsorption problem, whatever, okay? For whatever reason, this diagram is showing us that blood calcium levels are becoming too low. When that happens, there is a gland known as the parathyroid. So it's actually on the back side of the thyroid. This is an artist's representation of the thyroid gland that sits in the neck. And with this picture, we're actually looking at the back of the thyroid, and you'll notice we have these 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of dots on the back that are represented in red. Those are the parathyroid glands. And when blood calcium becomes too low, what the parathyroid glands do is they release a hormone which is known as parathyroid hormone, or PTH. So if you look at this part of the diagram here, the parathyroid has recognized blood calcium is too low. It's released PTH. What PTH does, or parathyroid hormone, is it stimulates the osteoclasts in the bone. And remember, the osteoclasts are those cells that are resorbing bone. They're breaking down the bone and they're releasing the calcium from the bone into the blood. By doing that, if we start breaking down bone and releasing its calcium into the blood, we're going to be able to bring our calcium levels back up to where they need to be, even if you're not getting enough calcium in your diet or you're unable to absorb calcium for whatever reason. However, your bones are going to take a hit, right? They're losing calcium, so they're losing strength, they're losing density. If you look at the other side of this graph, this is showing what you might see if there's a sufficient and maybe excess levels of calcium in the blood. So maybe you've just eaten a really calcium-rich diet. In that case, the thyroid gland, so that's the anterior part of this organ that we have sitting in the neck. The thyroid gland is going to increase release of a hormone which is known as calcitonin. At the same time, we're going to see a decrease in release of parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland. Calcitonin stimulates the deposit of calcium in the bones. So it's strengthening the bones by doing so, but the other effect of this is that's going to bring our blood calcium levels back to where they need to be so that the heart can function properly and the diaphragm can function properly and all of the other muscles of the body can contract properly as well. So I mentioned that hormones can be involved. They can cause a net increase in bone development. They can also cause a net decrease in bone, even as an adult, if you're not getting enough calcium or whatever. What I want to talk about next is that mechanical stress mechanism. So when I first introduced this idea, I said that bones are strengthened by exercise. They're strengthened by activity. They're strengthened by forces being applied to them, and this is true. So Wolff's law is a law that says basically bone grows when it's stressed and it weakens when it's not stressed. So if you are active, particularly if you're doing weight-bearing activities, lifting weights, your bones are much, much stronger than someone who is a couch potato. But really, any kind of exercise that's putting weight on the bones, that's stressing the bones, is going to help the bones grow in response to it. About 10 years ago, I was at the Smithsonian, the Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C., and they had a fascinating exhibit called Written in Bone. And in that exhibit, they had all sorts of different examples of bones and ways that bones will change due to stresses or not stresses, and how we can use bones to find out all sorts of information about previous cultures. And one of the things that they had in this exhibit is they had a skeleton from a man who was a quadriplegic. So his legs were paralyzed. He was in a wheelchair. He used his arms to power his wheelchair and to get around. And in that man's skeleton, his upper arm bone, his humerus, because that had taken over really as the weight-bearing, the active area of his body for making him mobile, his humerus was much, much larger than his femur, which is the upper bone in the leg. Typically, the femur is really the strongest weight-bearing bone of the body because it's carrying almost the entire weight of the body. This femur had basically wasted away because it wasn't being stressed, it wasn't being active, it wasn't having forces applied to it, whereas his humerus had become absolutely huge because that was the muscles attached to the bone, applying forces to the bone that were helping him to be mobile. If you look at this diagram over here, so this is a femur, and this over here is called the head of the femur, and it's where the leg actually attaches into the hips. And if you look at this part of the diagram, we've got this little arrow here that says the weight of the body is applied to the head, and it is. So the torso is basically resting on the head of the femur, and we have a big load. We have a lot of pressure, a lot of forces that are being applied to this bone right there. If you look at this further, what this diagram is trying to tell you is that on this side of the bone, so on the side of the bone where the load or where the force of the torso is being applied, we have a lot of compressive forces. So the bone is being smushed together very forcefully due to the weight of the torso all along its length on the side of the bone where the torso actually is. Over here on this other side of the bone, it's actually being pulled apart. So it's being stressed in that way. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of pulling forces on the bone on that side, the side opposite where the load's actually being applied from the torso. If you look right here, so these arrows are representing. So we've got compressive forces, things being smushed together over here. We've got pulling forces, things being stretched apart over here. You'll notice right there in the middle of the bone, we have an area where there are no compressive forces and there are no pulling forces. So we've actually got a situation where those forces cancel each other out right through the bone. One of the things that you're going to learn about bone, if you haven't already, is that right here through the middle, it's actually hollow, and it can get away with that because there are no stresses through the middle of the bone. So a bone can be hollow, these long bones, which makes them weigh much, much less, but they are just as strong as they would otherwise be because there are no forces being applied through the middle of the bone. So you've had kind of a brief introduction to the hormonal mechanism. We've talked a little bit about the role of forces, activity, exercise, being able to strengthen bone. What you're going to see in your activity today is a little bit about an athlete that has a condition known as osteoporosis. So we normally think about osteoporosis being something that affects older women, and I'll talk about the reasons for that in a minute. But first I want to kind of show you what osteoporosis actually is. So if you look at this first picture that I have here, what you're seeing is spongy bone. And spongy bone consists of branching bars of bone that are known as trabeculae, with some open spaces in between that are filled with a marrow-like red, very, very vascular tissue. So this is what healthy spongy bone looks like. If you look at the diagram just below that, you'll notice we've got much more open space. The trabeculae are a lot thinner. In a lot of cases, they're completely gone. This is a bone that's going to be much more weak. It's not strong. It's not healthy. It's very prone to breaking. And this is what happens to bones in osteoporosis. So we talked about earlier this idea that normally we've got our osteoblasts and our osteoclasts communicating with each other. And if you're keeping your diet consistent and you're keeping exercise consistent, that they just put up the same amount of bone that's taken down every day, and you don't have a net decrease in bone mass or a net increase in bone mass over time. However, if osteoclasts, for whatever reason, start outpacing osteoblasts, and we start chronically resorbing more bone than we're actually putting down, that's how osteoporosis occurs. So if you have a consistently low calcium diet, that can lead to this situation over time. If you have a low vitamin D diet or you have a malabsorption problem, these are all situations where you're not getting enough calcium into the blood, so calcium is being taken out of the bones to replace what should be in the blood, and over time your bones are going to start to look like this. If you don't exercise a lot, or even in some cases if you're tremendously thin, so that you're not putting a lot of pressure on those bones, over time, if they're not being strengthened forcefully, they can start to look like this. So those are things that can lead to osteoporosis. Normally, we think of osteoporosis as a disease of older women, and here's why. Estrogen, which is produced by women of reproductive age, tends to have a strengthening and a protecting effect on the bones. So under the influence of estrogen, when it's being produced by a female's body, it tends to strengthen the bones, it tends to help build up the bones. When women go through menopause, and even slightly before that, estrogen levels in their body start to decrease. Once menopause has finished, there is effectively not really anything that's producing estrogen in their bodies anymore, and estrogen levels absolutely plummet. So you no longer have that effect of estrogen protecting the bones and helping the bones to stay strong. So this is going to happen for most women, where we start to really see this decrease in estrogen followed by a decrease in bone mass starting at around age 35, and then just continue in the 40s and 50s, and then eventually a lot of women will become osteoporotic because of that particular situation. We don't see osteoporosis happening in men as often, and there's a couple of reasons for this. So the first one is women have this sudden decrease in their sex hormone. They stop producing estrogen and they don't produce it for the rest of their lives. Men do not have a sudden drop. So men produce testosterone and they continue producing it through the entirety of their lives. So testosterone is the male equivalent of estrogen, and it's going to give some protection to the bones so that in men we don't start to see osteoporosis developing with age. The other reason that we see osteoporosis more often in females than males is females just usually live longer than males. So they start down this road because of decreases in estrogen at an earlier age, and then they have a lifespan that on average is 5 to 10 years longer than the average male's lifespan. So they've got a longer amount of time for osteoporosis to develop. If you are female, the best thing that you can do is lots of weight-bearing activities before the age of 35, if at all possible, to build up your bone as much as you possibly can before this natural decline in bone mass starts. But no matter what age you are, you can help to prevent this decrease and even help to build up your bones by starting, if you aren't, exercise programs, weight-bearing exercises, those kinds of things.